is seeing historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
When word got out that Florida was planning to release native snakes back into the wild to fight an invasive snake problem, the internet did what the internet does best. It mocked it mercilessly. Comment sections filled up with jokes about fighting fire with fire, about a state already overrun with reptiles deciding the answer was more reptiles. Late-night hosts found an easy punchline. But strip away the jokes, and what you find is a quietly remarkable story about a swamp that nearly died, a predator that vanished and came back, and a plan that looked absurd on the surface but was actually one of the more thoughtful conservation efforts attempted in modern memory. To understand why anyone would think releasing snakes was the solution, you have to go back to how the problem started in the first place. The Florida Everglades was never supposed to become a cautionary tale. For thousands of years it functioned as one of the most productive wetland ecosystems on the planet, a slow-moving river of grass stretching across the southern tip of the state, home to wading birds, alligators, deer, bobcats, and a tightly woven food web that had evolved together over millennia. Then, sometime around the early 1990s, the Burmese python entered the picture. The exact origin story varies depending on who's telling it. Some point to a damaged breeding facility during a major hurricane. Others point to the much more mundane and far more common reality: exotic pet owners, overwhelmed by snakes that grew far larger than they expected, releasing them into canals and marshes rather than dealing with the cost and difficulty of rehoming an animal that can stretch well over 10 feet long. Whatever the precise spark, the result was the same. A massive, adaptable, ambush predator with no natural enemies in its new home found itself in a landscape that suited it almost perfectly. Warm, wet, full of prey, and with effectively zero competition for the apex predator role. Pythons began to spread through the southern wetlands, and for years almost nobody noticed, because pythons are not loud animals. They don't roar or stampede or leave obvious destruction in their wake. They simply sit, coiled and patient, until something walks close enough to grab. By the time researchers started taking the problem seriously, the numbers were already staggering. Surveys of mammal populations in python-heavy areas of the Everglades showed catastrophic declines. Raccoons, possums, and rabbits had dropped by the vast majority of their former numbers in the hardest-hit zones. Bobcat sightings fell sharply. Deer, once common enough to be unremarkable, became rare enough that a sighting felt noteworthy. The python wasn't just adding a new predator to the ecosystem, it was hollowing it out from the middle, removing the small and mid-sized mammals that everything else in the food web depended on, directly or indirectly. Florida tried almost everything to fight back. Python hunting contests turned the problem into a kind of public spectacle, offering cash prizes to whoever could bring in the most snakes during a set window of days. These events generated headlines and goodwill, and the hunters involved were often genuinely skilled, but the math never worked in their favor. Even highly motivated, well-trained hunters pulling hundreds of snakes out of the swamp over the course of a year were removing a sliver of a population that researchers estimated to be in the tens of thousands, possibly more, spread across a landscape that is simply too vast, too thick, and too difficult to search effectively. Pythons are masters of camouflage, capable of lying motionless in dense vegetation for hours, and a snake that doesn't want to be found usually isn't. The state didn't stop at hunting contests. Wildlife agencies hired professional contract trackers to work the swamp full-time. Researchers experimented with radio tagging male pythons during breeding season, since males will travel long distances to find females, effectively turning a tagged snake into a living map that could lead biologists straight to breeding aggregations and the much harder to find females. Robotic decoys, scent train detection dogs, thermal cameras, and aerial drones all got tried at various points. Each method had its successes, and each method, on its own, proved nowhere near sufficient to meaningfully shrink the overall population. Year after year, scientists arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion: total eradication of an established population this size, in terrain this dense, was simply not realistic with the tools available. The best anyone could hope for was containment and slowdown, not victory. It was somewhere in that long stretch of frustration, after the traps and the contests and the high-tech gadgets had all proven only partially effective, that conservationists started looking backward instead of forward. They started asking a different question. Instead of how do we remove this predator, they asked what predator used to exist here that could naturally compete with it, and what happened to that predator. The answer led them to a snake that most people outside of Florida had never heard of, the eastern indigo snake. Long before pythons ever arrived, the eastern indigo was one of the dominant predators of the southeastern pine forests, a glossy, blue-black snake that could grow to roughly 8 or 9 feet, fast-moving, intelligent, and almost fearless. What made the indigo unusual among snakes is its diet. Most snake species specialize, but indigos are broad, opportunistic predators that will eat just about anything they can overpower, including other snakes. Critically, indigos show resistance to the venom of pit vipers like rattlesnakes, meaning they can hunt and kill venomous snakes without much risk to themselves. They don't rely on constriction either. An indigo will typically just pin prey down with sheer physical strength and swallow it. This was once a snake whose range stretched from the Florida peninsula up through Georgia and into parts of Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina, thriving across the longleaf pine ecosystem that used to blanket much of the southeastern United States. But that ecosystem itself collapsed over the 20th century. Longleaf pine forests were logged extensively, converted to farmland, and fragmented by development, until only a small fraction of the original habitat remained. The indigo snake's fate was tightly bound to another animal entirely, the gopher tortoise. Indigos rely heavily on the burrows tortoises dig, using them for shelter, temperature regulation, and protection from predators and wildfires. When tortoise populations decline due to habitat loss and, during harder economic periods, being hunted for food, the indigo's available shelter disappeared right along with them. Add in decades of indigos being captured for the exotic pet trade and inadvertently killed during rattlesnake collection drives that involve gassing tortoise burrows, and the species collapsed to a fraction of its former range. By the late 1970s, the eastern indigo was formally listed as a threatened species, hanging on in only scattered, isolated pockets, mostly within Florida. For decades, that was simply where the story sat. A once common predator reduced to a relic, protected on paper but absent across the vast majority of land it used to call home. Nobody was thinking about indigo snakes as a solution to anything, because there weren't enough of them left to solve their own survival problem, let alone anyone else's. What changed things was a slow, patient, largely unglamorous conservation effort that had actually been underway for years before the python crisis ever made headlines. Conservation groups and wildlife agencies had been quietly breeding eastern indigos in captivity, restoring patches of longleaf pine habitat, and working to bring back gopher tortoise populations so there would be functioning burrows waiting for any reintroduced snakes. This work had nothing to do with pythons originally. It was a straightforward effort to save a threatened native species from disappearing entirely. The python angle only became relevant later, once researchers realized that a predator capable of eating venomous snakes might also be capable of preying on juvenile pythons, and that restoring the indigo to its old range could, indirectly, help rebalance an ecosystem that pythons had thrown into chaos. So when wildlife officials finally began releasing captive-bred indigos back into restored habitat, much of the public reaction treated it as a fresh idea, a panicked, last-ditch experiment cooked up in response to the python invasion. In reality, it was the culmination of a restoration program that had been building for years, simply intersecting with a crisis that gave it new urgency and a wider audience. The jokes about fighting snakes with more snakes missed the actual point entirely. Nobody was releasing pythons to fight pythons. They were releasing a long-absent native predator back into a landscape it had occupied for thousands of years before either humans or invasive snakes ever showed up. The early results have been encouraging, if modest. Released indigos have been tracked surviving for years in restored habitat, with researchers periodically confirming sightings of individually identifiable animals that were released in earlier batches, proof that they weren't simply dying off quietly out of sight. Then came the moment conservationists had been hoping for without daring to expect too soon, confirmation of wild reproduction. Trail cameras and field surveys eventually documented hatchling indigos and restored habitat whose parents were among the released, captive-bred population, but who themselves had never been tagged or handled by humans. That detail matters enormously. A snake born in the wild, to wild-release parents, with no human intervention in its own birth, is the clearest possible signal that a reintroduction program has crossed from simply surviving into actually functioning as a self-sustaining population. It's the difference between life support and recovery. None of this means the python problem is solved, and no serious scientist involved in the indigo reintroduction has ever claimed otherwise. A modest, slowly recovering population of native snakes cannot single-handedly undo 2 decades of explosive python growth across a swamp the size of a small country. Indigos primarily threaten smaller, younger pythons rather than the massive adult specimens that have become the public face of the crisis. What the program offers isn't elimination, it's restoration of balance, one small piece of a much larger ecological puzzle that also includes ongoing hunting programs, habitat management, and continued research into other potential control methods. Native predators like bobcats and alligators have also occasionally been documented taking on pythons in the years since the crisis began, suggesting that some native wildlife may slowly be adapting to treat the invader as potential prey rather than purely as a threat. What makes the indigo story compelling isn't that it single-handedly defeats an invasive species. It's that it represents a fundamentally different philosophy than most invasive species responses, which tend to focus entirely on killing the invader. Here, conservationists looked at a damaged system and asked what piece was missing, then spent years patiently restoring that piece, fully aware that results would be slow and uncertain. It's a strategy built on ecological humility, the recognition that humans cannot simply engineer their way out of a problem this complex through traps and bounties alone, and that sometimes the most effective long-term fix is putting back what was taken away in the first place, then giving nature the time it needs to find its footing again. The people who mocked the plan when it was first announced weren't entirely wrong to be skeptical. On paper, releasing snakes to fix a snake problem does sound like exactly the kind of thing that goes badly in a movie. But the mockery said more about how unfamiliar most people are with the eastern indigo's actual history and ecological role than it did about the soundness of the science behind the decision. Florida wasn't gambling on a wild experiment. It was finishing a restoration project that had been quietly in motion for years, one that just happened to arrive at exactly the moment the state needed every advantage it could find. Whether the eastern indigo can establish itself widely enough, across enough of its old range, to become a lasting fixture of the Everglades ecosystem again remains an open question, one that will likely take years of continued monitoring to answer. But for a species that was once written off as functionally gone from most of its historic territory, simply being back in the conversation, reproducing on its own, and quietly chipping away at one of the most stubborn invasive species problems in the country is already a result that very few people would have predicted. Sometimes the plan that gets laughed at the loudest turns out to be the one that was thought through the most carefully.